When Emmy and I started planning our family visit and vacation in Europe, one of the things we had to decide quite early in the preparation process was whether we are able and willing to travel light. That is, with a carry-on bag and a small enough bag that qualifies as a personal item on an airplane, so that we do not have to worry about checked-in bags not making it on time to our final destination, while also making our traveling by bus or train much easier. We already went on a similar, but even more extensive trip 6 years ago, but back then we were traveling in September, not in May, and this meant now, among other things, that we had to expect various temperatures between such different places like Lisbon or Seville on the one hand, and London, UK, and Eastern Carpathian Mountains in Transylvania on the other hand. Anyhow, we did manage to pack suitable clothing for both the temperatures close to 40 degrees heat at one end of the spectrum and almost freezing temperature on the other. While traveling to familiar places is usually less stress-free adventure, at least for me personally, traveling to totally unfamiliar places means a lot of worry and extra stress. One time we had to rent a car to drive for about 4 hours to reach our next destination, and that few hours was certainly the most stressful part of this trip, for me at least. Long story short, while we had a very good time away, and we're still full of good memories to cherish and thousands of pictures to browse through, it is still a very good feeling to be back at the place that is our chosen and beloved home. Everywhere else is good, says a Hungarian proverb, but the best is at home. And I couldn't agree more. Now, going away for a while, whether it's a vacation or a family visit, is one thing, but leaving behind a familiar place and heading toward an unfamiliar country, thus leaving behind all that which gives one a sense of safety and security, not only losing one's identity rooted in the very place and environment one lives. Now, this is something rather terrifying, and it might feel like literally being uprooted. A feeling that is known to all those who are forcibly displaced or are refugees, who have to leave their familiar homes and head towards an unknown place and face an unknown future. According to the most current stats from UN, there are more than 103 million people who had to flee their homes because of war, economic or natural disaster. And most of them are coming from just a few countries, like Syria, Ukraine, Venezuela, Sudan, and so on. Now, turning our attention to the biblical story of Abraham and Sarah, we immediately recognize that this trip abroad was neither a vacation trip nor a forced displacement. Leaving their home was voluntary. That is, it happened because of a divine call that has been freely accepted. However, the command to go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you still must have sounded very challenging, especially to someone who, according to the Genesis story, was already 75 years old. Now imagine that sentence addressed to you, especially if you're older than 75. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Either way, this particular story of a journey of a family from the eastern part of the Middle East which would be today's Iran, toward the most western part of Asia, in the Holy Land, became the beginning of a non-geographical journey of humanity from being polytheistic toward becoming monotheistic. That is, believing in one God instead of many gods. In other words, due to the faith journey accompanied with the physical journey of Abraham and Sarah from the east to the west, now more than half of all the nations of the globe, that's more than 55% or so, believe that there is one God, creator and sustainer of the universe as we know it. That is to say, the relatively small nation of the Jewish people with about 15 million members today. There are also more than 2.3 billion Christians of all denominations and almost 2 billion Muslims of all kinds who can be regarded as the spiritual descendants or distant relatives of Abraham and Sarah. While we all are distant relatives when it comes to Adam and Eve, of course, but that's another story. The biblical story we just heard comes to us from beyond 2.5 thousand years, and certainly the foundational story of the monotheistic faith in the one eternal God who has chosen one particular couple to become not just the ancestor of one particular nation, but to be the ancestor of many nations, and to become a blessing for all the nations of the earth, eventually. And a huge chunk of the first book of the Bible, that is chapters 12 to 25 of Genesis, is the story of Abraham and Sarah. If you are not familiar with the story, or even if you are, it's worth reading or rereading it. Now, the beginning of the story shows, in a way, how faith, in a biblical sense, does not mean believing abstract things about an invisible being who we can't even imagine. Biblical faith is rather something that is closer to trust, and particularly trusting the voice of the ground of our being, the eternal one who calls the believer, the one who trusts, that is, to face the unfamiliar with courage and hope, leaving behind the known for the sake of the unknown, the safe for the sake of uncertain, and hope that this radical change could lead to a better future, albeit the transformation might happen to a long period of time. The second reading from the letter of Paul highlights the fact that Abraham and Sarah had to wait about 25 years before they were able to see their offspring, who was supposed to settle and inherit the promised land at a much later time. One of the things that especially resonates with me in this biblical story is that no matter how old we are, God might still have beautiful plans for us individually or collectively, for our extended families and congregations. Each and every one of us, by God's grace and God's will, could become an instrument of hope and inspiration, both for present as well as for the future generations. The question is whether we are open and willing to listen to the divine voice of the Holy Spirit, who speaks to us just as much as she spoke to Abraham and Sarah. Are we willing to listen to the divine voice? Another message or lesson from this particular Genesis story might be that the actions of the individuals do have an influence on the flow of history beyond our widest imagination. In other words, what you do now individually, or what we do together collectively, will have an effect on the outcome of things. If not in the short term, then certainly in the long term. Not so long ago, people were living their own lives so that they were always conscious about the fate of their children or children's children, rather than just focusing on themselves, being selfish and paying attention only to the me, the I, and myself. As for the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, they like to talk and think in terms of what is affecting not 2 or 3 generations, but rather a whole 7 generations down the road. Now, this kind of mentality is certainly not foreign to the biblical way of thinking as far as the fate of multiple generations are concerned. So this is one more reason to learn to regard all things in their historical and long-term context. The biblical narrative does not give us any clue why Abraham and Sarah have been chosen by God to become the father and mother of a multitude of nations down the road of history. The only thing we know is that both Abraham and Sarah was willing to listen to the divine voice that called them out of the familiar to the unfamiliar, out of the ordinary to the extraordinary dimensions of life. And we also have a 20/20 hindsight in history that we know for a fact that the divine promise has become a reality. They became the ancestors of a multitude of nations. As for all those who consider themselves today monotheists, that is, who believe that there is one creator God who is the father and mother of all, the giver of life and ground of our being, the biblical characters and story of Abraham and Sarah are now a source of both inspiration as well as spiritual blessing. In the gospel story, we heard how Matthew had been called to become a follower of Jesus, then how the sick woman was healed by merely touching the garment of Jesus, and also the dead girl being raised in the front of skeptical and scornful people. Listening to these stories after having listened to the story of Abraham and Sarah, one cannot help but think that these stories also might be specific interpretations of the biblical understanding of what faith is. If so, then faith here is definitely not an intellectual assent to something that would be beyond the grasp of our human minds, as faith is usually portrayed today. In contrast, faith in this particular gospel story is presented as a concrete manifestation of a personal trust in the one who is able to heal or reconcile. Trust in the one who is able to heal or reconcile. Jesus, that is the one who saves, called Matthew the one who was a hated and despised tax collector. And this calling meant a clear indication that he will be included in the inner circle of disciples, and if so, then he will be saved from the misery and burden of the social segregation that was due to his behavior, that in turn was regarded as unacceptable by the powers that be. Matthew's calling and salvation story thus meant a social form of redemptive grace. As a counterexample to the grumbling Pharisees, we can see a leader of a synagogue who put his full trust in Jesus' ability to bring back his beloved girl to this life. And Jesus was able to do that even if the rest of the leader's family seemed to have found it quite ridiculous to even think of such a thing. And finally, we also have the example of a shy woman who, due to her desperation and deep faith, trusted Jesus to the extent that her faith itself became the instrument of her healing. Your faith has made you well, told Jesus to her. So the question gives itself, what is your understanding of faith? What is our understanding of faith? Is our understanding of faith closer to or farther away from the biblical understanding of faith, and that we think of it as an act of trusting in the power of the Eternal One, trusting in God's healing, trusting in God's saving or life-transforming power. These are just a few questions to ponder, worth pondering next week. May the Spirit of God grant us the grace of faith, the grace of a biblical faith, so that we are able to have spiritual trust in the one who is able and willing to save us from whatever we need to be saved from, the Eternal One who wants to heal our wounds and who desires to transform our lives for the benefit of our immediate families, as well as for the sake of blessing all those who come into our lives and who might need our concrete help in the here and now. So be it. Amen.